Welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I am Scott Koenig, and I'm a social studies consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. The Michigan Department of Education encourages teachers to lean into teaching the rich and diverse history of our country and world. The presentation you will see today intends to provide educators additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, they will be better able to create lessons that help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to work with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments, bringing their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Dr. LaKisha Simmons. Dr. Simmons will look through the life and times of Harriet Jacobs to explore Black women's experiences in slavery, women's anti-slavery activism, and the importance of source material, such as slaves' narratives. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. Teaching Comprehensive History webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn you may provide opportunities for students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives that you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are encouraged to consider how this content and perspective could be incorporated to enhance learning in your community. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. LaKisha Simmons, a professor of history and women's and gender studies at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on the lives, writing, and histories of Black children and families in the 19th and 20th centuries. She is an award-winning teacher for her work in the classroom, including the distinguished Arthur F. Thurnall Professorship Award, an award earned through nomination by students and peers for teaching excellence. Dr. Simmons encourages her students to look at primary source material and engage in project-based learning. Welcome, Dr. Simmons.
Hello, thank you. It's so great to be here with you all. I wish we could be in person, but it's wonderful to have this opportunity. I'm using two screens, so if I look to the side, that's why the whole webinar thing is a little tricky, but I try to do okay with it. So the title of this webinar that I'm doing, which has three pieces, is called Women's Anti-Slavery Activism, the Life and Times of Harriet Jacobs, who was born around 1815 and died in 1897. The goal of these three webinars is to introduce you all to Harriet Jacobs, her autobiography, which is called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which she wrote under the pseudonym Linda Brent, and Harriet Jacobs' activism after escaping from slavery. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is an excellent slave narrative that has become increasingly popular in academic scholarship on Black women's history. Students love it. When I teach it, they actually read it. I love it. It's also really easy to break up into incidents or short stories to share with your students rather than requiring them to read the whole thing. So this is like a promo for Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. The webinars also use Jacobs related primary source material as well as other primary sources to draw out the wider world of the 19th century, including Black women in slavery, Black women during and after the Civil War, and Black women's anti-slavery activism. So I just want to give you a little bit of a view of where we are in this discussion. The webinars that I'm doing, there are three of them. The first one was a story about how Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was written and also how it was forgotten and then remembered by scholars. We are now in webinar 2, which this lecture is going to be about Black women and girls in slavery and freedom. And then the one next week will be focused more on women's activism before, during, and after the Civil War. So looking at Harriet Jacobs and her friends and the kinds of work that they were doing during to help African Americans in the country. Okay, so let me go to today, which I'm calling Black Women and Girls in Slavery and Freedom. A lot of this work that I'm presenting today really intersects with my own research. I've done a lot of research on the history of childhood in particular. So I'm going to be integrating some of that in here. And the subtitle is The Last Place They Thought of, or Loopholes of Retreat. I couldn't decide which subtitle. They are both quotations that you can find within Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl. And they're both ways that Harriet Jacobs was describing what resistance during slavery looks like. And so I think the theme for today is to start thinking about what are some small areas of resistance that enslaved African Americans did, and how we could think about resistance. And the last place they thought of, or loopholes of retreat, are two ways of thinking about resistance that's hidden, right? That's behind the scenes. It's in the last place they thought of. That is a small sort of loophole that undoes the system of slavery in a small way. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit. All right. I should note that Black women and girls in slavery and freedom is such a huge topic. I feel like I've taught a Harriet Jacobs class before, so doing Harriet Jacobs in 3 lectures is like really hard for me. Doing Black women and girls in slavery in 1 lecture, I feel like it deserves 30. So I had to make some tough choices. So these are this is the outline and the themes that I chose. Part 1, I'm going to talk about enslaved children and work. Part 2, I'm going to focus in on reading as resistance. Part 3, I'll talk about degrees of freedom. So how might we think about places of freedom within a slave system? And then part 4, we'll be talking specifically about fugitivity. Yeah, and the one big theme that's missing from here is motherhood, which is a major theme in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I'll talk a little bit about Harriet Jacobs as a mother during the fugitivity part, but just note that if I could, a 4th lecture in this series would have to focus just specifically on motherhood, and I'm sorry that I have left that out. I had to make choices, so I just went with it, you all. Okay, so let's start with part 1, enslaved children and work. And this is something I'm writing about specifically right now. I have here a little quotation from Thomas Jefferson's workbook, where he wrote, children till 10 years old serve as nurses. From 10 to 16, the boys make nails, the girls spin. At 16, go into the ground or learn trades. And by going to the ground, he meant work in the fields, or they learn a skilled trade. I want to talk first about this nursing piece. What was nursing, especially as it related to children who were enslaved in their labor? Nursing, when people referred to nursing, depending on the plantation and the person writing, it could include all of this type of labor, which is taking care of younger enslaved children, taking care of younger white children, or taking care of elderly or sick folks who could have been enslaved or white. And so all of this would have been considered under the rubric of nursing. One of the ways that I want to think about resistance today is, what does it mean to build a sense of self and an interior world, even when the outside world is trying to stamp that out of you? What does it mean to nurture self, community, family in the face of the destruction of all those things? And that is a problem that enslaved children and enslaved communities had to face every day. And so one example from the work I'm doing now is from a WPA interview with an elderly man who was enslaved as a child. And he talked about the nursing work he did as a child. He took, I guess you could say, he took care of an elderly white man, and his job as a child was just to fan above the man while he laid in bed so that no flies would fall on him. And this man was elderly, he was sick, and he was dying. And his job was just to stand there all day and fan. And he talked about how difficult that work was, how he would get punished if he fell asleep while he was standing there and dropped the fan. and how the man would yell at him and say, you better not cry or I will have you beaten. And he said in his WPA interview as a older man, remembering back to this time, he said, I did cry, but never in front of him. And I think about that as a moment of like thinking what the interior self looks like, right? Like, what does it mean to have a self? He chose to mention that he did cry, right? He did have feelings, that this labor was actually really quite hard, but that he did it in a way that was like behind the scenes. And so I think of that as like the building of interior self and also resilience in perhaps a disturbing way, but that he carried with him for the rest of his life. Other kinds of work that enslaved children did was work that required, small bodies or small hands. So in Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, his plantation, they worked in the nailery. And I just want to note that Monticello has a great website with tons of really good stories and information about working lives on the plantation. And young boys, both enslaved and free throughout the country, worked as chimney sweeps. So these are just some pictures. Some children also labored as companions to white children or to white adults. And in my research, I've been thinking about this kind of labor as a kind of the labor of pets. What does it mean to labor as a companion when you're just a child? And you can think about pets in two ways. I've been thinking about it as pets, like, we have today, I have a dog who is my companion at my home, right? So you could think about a pet in that way. But I've also been thinking about the kind of enslaved children who were petted or treated well by their enslavers. And so here is Mary Reynolds at the age of 105, who in a WPA narrative also talked about her life as a laborer, as a child who was enslaved. Harriet Jacobs' first enslaver was a white woman who kept Jacobs by her side. She taught her to read and to write, but she did not free Jacobs in her will when she passed away. I think Harriet Jacobs was 12 years old when she passed away. Mary Reynolds first served as a companion to a white child whose name was Miss Sarah, and then sold to a man who had been recently widowed and who was lonely. And I'm just going to read a quotation from her WPA narrative. Mary Reynolds said, I was just about big enough to start playing with a broom and go about sweeping up, and not even half doing it, when Dr. Kilpatrick sold me. He sold me to an old white man in Trinity, and his wife died, and he didn't have chick or child or slave or nothing. Massa sold me cheap because he didn't want Miss Sarah to play with me anymore. That old man bought me a big doll, and he went off and left me all day with the door open. I just sat on the floor and played with that doll. I used to cry. He'd come home and give me something to eat, and then he'd go to bed, and I slept on the foot of the bed with him. I was scared all the time in the dark, and he never did close the door. This is a quotation from Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl with Harriet Jacobs talking about her first enslaver. And she said she was proud to labor for her. I like this quotation because it includes that word labor in it. So it highlights that she did see her time as a companion with this woman as work. And I also like this image of flowers for two reasons. One, in the quotation that I'm about to read, she talks about how she would pick flowers as part of her job as a child. But later, after she was inherited into another family, Harriet Jacobs' father passed away. And while his body sort of laid in wait, and it was really important in Black communities to go see the dead. And she found out that her father had just passed away. And while his body was there, her enslaver at the time, the mistress at the time, wouldn't allow her to go see her father. And instead she said, you know, we're preparing for a party, you have to go pick flowers for the decorations. And so this image of flowers to me is really powerful because it's both like the kinds of freedoms that she had when she was a very young child to like go and pick flowers as part of her job, and then the kinds of like devastation that she remembered in relationship to picking flowers when she was older. So now I'm going to read this quotation that's about her first enslaver. She said, "My mistress was so kind to me that I was always glad to do her bidding and proud to labor for her as much as my young years would permit. I would sit by her side for hours, sewing diligently with a heart as free from care as that of any free-born white child. When she thought I was tired, she would send me out to run and jump, and I always bounded to gather berries or flowers to decorate her room. Those were happy days, too happy to last. The slave child had no thought for the morrow, but there came that blight which too surely waits on every human being born to be chattel. My mistress had taught me the precepts of God's word. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, do ye even so unto them. But I was her slave, and I suppose she did not recognize me as her neighbor." So here we get a quotation about what she kind of calls the happy years of her life. Um, and there's a lot of reasons, other reasons they were happy too. Her father was still alive. When she was very little, her mother was around. But she starts to look on that time with a sense of like a little bit of bitterness and despair, because she realized that this woman that she loved as a child didn't love her back as a human, right? As a neighbor, she says, right? Or do unto others as you would do unto yourself. And so you can see that relationship that is colored by slavery, even though there was care and protection there, there was also this sense that she was being treated maybe more as a pet than as a human. This all comes from Jacob's chapter 1. So part 2 is going to be reading as a form of resistance, specifically reading in childhood. And so as Harriet Jacobs lays out the kind of love that she had for this mistress, but at the same time, the kind of difficulty that she had thinking back at that time, she continues to go on and talk about this relationship some more. She says, "I would give much to blot out from my memory that one great wrong, not having been emancipated at the death in her former owner's will. Instead of emancipated, she was given to the woman's niece, who was a toddler at the time. I would give much to blot out from my memory that one great wrong. As a child, I loved my mistress, and looking back on the happy days I spent with her, I try to think with less bitterness of this act of injustice. While I was with her, she taught me to read and spell, and for this privilege, which so rarely falls to the lot of a slave, I bless her memory." So I just want to highlight that thinking about reading and writing is so important, especially as we're teaching young people. And reading was a major form of resistance for Harriet Jacobs. Like, she was able to read and to escape slavery in a lot of ways because of her reading skills. It allowed her to read the Bible, and she was incredibly religious. And reading could also help connect people with others, to family members and other things. And so I think teaching students about the ways in which enslaved communities did use and could use reading and writing is really, really important. And we could think about reading as one of these loopholes of retreat. So I want to talk real quickly about two different sources that people could use in the classroom to think about this issue of reading. Both of them are from a picture book writer who is my favorite, in the genre of historical writing. And this is the book, Do You Know Them? Families Lost and Found After the Civil War by Shana Keller. Firstly, Keller's work is awesome because the picture books are built on primary source materials. So they're really wonderful to work with in the classroom because at the very young ages, you can really just read the stories, right? As students get older, it allows you to talk about primary source material and historical evidence in ways that are really important. And then for upper grades, I would even use this in a college classroom, to be honest. You could combine those discussions with thinking about creative nonfiction or creative historical fiction and think about what does it mean to like create a story around primary source material, which could allow the students to even create their own stories. A young girl who, because she's learned to read, it takes place after the Civil War. She stands up in front of her church and reads these lost and found ads. The lost and found ads were advertisements that African Americans placed in the newspaper to find family members that they had been separated from during slavery. And so after the Civil War, everybody, people were moving around, things were crazy, but everybody was looking for their family. They were trying to remake community. And so this is one of the ways we see reading as resistance. And she places in the story some of the real lost and found ads. And just so you know, there's this website called informationwanted.org, which is the Last Seen project that houses a lot of these advertisements. And you can see a found ad that's here on the screen that starts after many years. And it says Battle Creek, Michigan. So you could actually do a search for Michigan and find lost and found ads that are related specifically to Michigan. And this is a family who were enslaved in Kentucky who found each other. So happy story. And then the other book by Keller that I just wanted to mention is a Frederick Douglass book. It's called Bread for Words. And it's just the story of Frederick Douglass learning how to read. But the way that she writes the story is by using quotations that actually come out of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies. He had more than one. And so she uses that. And I think it's also a wonderful book for thinking about primary sources. What's really cool about her work at the end, she has like footnotes. So again, this is something that at the youngest grades, you might not even point out, but as kids are older and able to understand more complexity, you can even talk about footnotes and like, what does it mean that this relates back to an actual text that we can go to that page, look at the quote as Frederick Douglass actually wrote it. So I think that's just kind of cool. Okay, so that's reading. Part 3 is degrees of freedom. Here I want to talk a little bit more about the ways in which slavery was never a complete system, right? It was never a complete system of domination. I think that's the most important way to say it. And so when we're thinking about resistance, one of the things that we might think about is also the different ways in which people experienced freedom. We might think about when we're teaching slavery, like we want to talk about how people experienced slavery. It might not come to our minds that we should also be teaching about how people experienced freedom. So a lot of scholars in slavery studies talk about degrees of freedom, both during slavery and emancipation, because none of these things were like clean and clear cut. I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm just gonna do an example of one practice within the system of slavery that you see in Harriet Jacobs' narrative. And that is the system of self-hire, which really affected Harriet Jacobs and her family. So the self-hire system allowed some enslaved laborers to gain money and property. What was self-hire? Well, usually skilled laborers could hire out their skills to others and get money for it. this worked in different ways for different laborers. So for some laborers, they were enslaved with a particular family. Maybe they worked, let's say, as a carpenter. Let's say for Thomas Jefferson, he had a lot of carpenters. There was a lot of different kind of artwork that they were doing in skilled labor. In fact, if you remember his quotation, he said at 16 or whatever it was, at 10, the enslaved children were moved into two different tracks, like going into the fields or going into they were taught a trade. So you might work for one particular family, but if you were a carpenter for that family and maybe you had a lot of work for them, you could also work for other people, get paid for your labor, and then either send that money back to your enslaver, and they would allow you to keep a little bit. Other systems of self-hire, some skilled laborers worked completely independently, and they basically paid their enslavers a certain amount of money per year. So they might owe them $200 a year, and then they would have to go out and find work, do it, collect the money, and then, pay their yearly fee to their enslaver. Another way that self-hire worked was that people might work during the regular day, and at night they were allowed to do whatever they wanted, including taking money for their work at night. And so the self-hire system allowed some of these laborers to gain actual money and property. And some of the most common ways we see this is with bakers, cobblers, bricklayers, blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstress, also people who worked with animals. So if you had a skill like trading horses, also drivers of carriages. So if you think about like taxis and trucking, right? That all of this happened with different carriages. And so drivers who worked with horses and carriages could do that kind of work and get money. So Harriet Jacobs' father was a carpenter. He used his wages to have his own home. I don't know if he owned it or rented it, but both his wife, who was enslaved, and his children lived in the home with him until his wife died. And so that's one way of thinking about degrees of freedom. Her father did try to buy his family out of slavery, but it was often really difficult to do that, even if you had the money to, because you had to negotiate with enslavers who may not be willing to sell them to you and would always only do so at incredibly inflated prices. Harriet Jacobs' grandmother was also somebody who benefited from the self-hired system. As a child, she was actually emancipated by her enslaver, but she was kidnapped still as a child and sold back into slavery along with the rest of her family. She worked during evenings to earn extra money, and eventually she was able to buy her own home even while she was still enslaved. So she had this home when she was enslaved. It's a crazy story, but it's true. And eventually she was also able to buy her own freedom. It's a very complicated story, but she used her money to buy her own freedom. And one of her goals in life was to buy her children's freedom, and she was only ever able to buy 1 out of 5. I'll just mention that Mary Reynolds, the woman who was 105 that we saw the picture of, her father was a free man who worked with pianos. He fixed broken pianos. So he was also somebody who benefited from the self-hire system. And he was able to buy his own freedom, and he also tried to buy his family's freedom, but was never successful. Another just really famous example of this is Elizabeth Keckley, who was a skilled laborer. She was a seamstress who was able to buy her own freedom and that of her daughter. She secured a loan from one of her clients and then was able to pay her back. She wrote a slave narrative that was published after slavery was over called 30 Years a Slave and 4 in the White House. She was First Lady Lincoln's seamstress. So you can see some of her work here, and there's tons of information about her online and great source material to teach about her as well. So this next part is going to be talking about fugitivity and thinking about the kind of loopholes of retreat that Harriet Jacobs was able to take advantage of as she tried to gain her freedom. On this slide, you see a fugitive slave ad that was placed by Harriet Jacobs, enslaver. So as I mentioned, Harriet Jacobs was inherited by a toddler whose father was James Norcom. And you can see on the bottom of this advertisement, James Norcom's name. And here is an advertisement after Harriet Jacobs went missing. And it says, $100 reward will be given for the apprehension and delivery of my servant girl, Harriet. She's a light mulatto, 21 years of age, about 5 feet 4 inches high, and of a thick and corpulent habit, having on her head a thick covering of black hair that curls naturally, but which can be easily combed straight. She speaks easily and fluently and has an agreeable carriage and address. Being a good seamstress, she has been accustomed to dress well and has a variety of very fine clothes made in the prevailing fashion, and will probably appear if abroad tricked out in gay and fashionable finery. So you can see this advertisement. Okay. I'll also just read a quick quotation that comes from Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So I'm going to talk more about how Harriet Jacobs escaped, but at first she was hidden. She escaped from Norcom's plantation, and she was hidden in her by friends and family friends, then hid in a swamp for a little while outside of the town in North Carolina that she was from, and then hid in her grandmother's house. And so you can see here, actually, he says that he thinks she's in the North. In her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she says, the opinion was often expressed that I was in the free states. Very rarely did anyone suggest that I might be in the vicinity. They had the least suspicion rested on my grandmother's house, it would have been burned to the ground. But it was the last place they thought of. Yet there was no place where slavery existed that could have afforded me so good a place of concealment. And so here, but it was the last place they thought of, again, kind of highlighting how she was hiding in plain sight. Before I go a little bit farther into the specifics of thinking about her concealment and thinking about her fugitive status, I want to briefly tell you how we got there, because I kind of skipped from childhood straight to her attempts to find freedom. So the enslavers that she lived with was Dr. James and Mary Horniblow Norcom. James Norcom was the father of the young girl who inherited Harriet Jacobs. In the book, his pseudonym is Dr. Flint. So if you hear Dr. Flint, that's the same person as Dr. James Norcom. And Harriet's family was enslaved by the Horniblow family. That's the family that had enslaved Harriet Jacobs' grandmother and mother. And so that's how she ended up with this particular, inherited by this particular couple's daughter. When she was inherited by their daughter, she was 12 years old. And as she grew into her teenage years, Dr. James Norcom became obsessed with her. And part of his desire was for her to submit to him completely, and become his mistress. And he offered her a lot of finery, a lot of like a house of her own, all of these things. But she knew that that was like a path that she didn't want to take. Um, and also that it wasn't a path towards absolute freedom for her. She felt like that was um, a path to desperation, honestly. And so a lot of her teenage years were spent trying to evade um, Dr. Norcom. His wife was also extremely jealous. So there's this part of the text where she like wakes up to the woman right at her face, like whispering in her ear. And she's like really afraid for her life, essentially. And so her teenage years were filled with just stress. I would call it actually mental abuse and trying to figure out a way out of this situation. Um, she, the first, before I mention that, I just want to point out this other slave notice, which is another Norcom notice for an enslaved laborer who was a carpenter. And you can see in this notice, it says $25. And if you remember to the Harriet Jacobs notice, it was 100, right? So it just kind of highlights, and this enslaved laborer was a skilled carpenter. So that would be, more important, more money. But Harriet Jacobs was 100. So just like to highlight that kind of obsession. So one of the ways that Harriet Jacob tried to choose a different path for herself was to, she said, to try to choose her own lover. This is actually a really interesting place in the book that I love to talk to my students about, because Harriet Jacobs is really torn up about her relationship with Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, who was a young white lawyer in their town. He had come like freshly from law school at the University of North Carolina. I imagine him to be a really smart person. I imagine Harriet Jacobs, obviously, to also be a really smart person. And they started a relationship and had 2 children, Louisa and Joseph Jacobs. And Harriet Jacobs writes about it as like one of her worst mistakes. Also, like, she's so stupid, all these kinds of ways that she's remembering this teenage self that got into a relationship with him. She sees it very much as like instrumental in trying to keep Dr. Norcom away from her, because she sort of has this dramatic moment where she reveals to him, actually, I'm already pregnant, and so I can't be your mistress, as a way of like hoping that Samuel Sawyer will help protect her from Dr. Norcom and maybe even buy her and her children out of slavery. He never buys her. And in fact, Dr. Norcom wouldn't sell her to anyone. So he just said, oh, well, it's my daughter's enslaved person. I can't sell her anyway. And it probably would have been hard for him. But it's just interesting to have discussions with students about this, because they have a hard time thinking about Harriet Jacobs as like an older woman remembering back to her teenage years. So I'll ask them, like, do you think she was really in love with him? And they're like, no, it was just, she was just trying to do this and that and another. And they have a hard time kind of thinking about the source material, like the moment she's writing, as being one in which she's being super critical of herself in ways that maybe aren't fair, I think, to her. But they really believe everything Harriet Jacobs says. Anyway, so Samuel Treadwell Sawyer was her father's children. He actually ends up becoming a representative in the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress from North Carolina. Yeah, and those are her children, or photographs believed to be her children, of Louisa and Joseph Jacobs. Okay, so how do we get to this great escape? This is a question of both space and place, and how space and place can help us think about different modes of resistance. So the question I have here is, how did enslaved people use spaces of oppression to create their own notions of freedom, family, self, and power outside of the system of slavery? Right? How did enslaved people use spaces of oppression to create their own small spaces of freedom? Harriet Jacobs calls this the loophole of retreat. That's chapter 21 from Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And this image that you see on the screen is actually Harriet Jacobs' grandmother's house. And we have the dimensions of the house. We know a lot about the physicality of the actual house. On the back of the house was built a shed area. It was an addition. And at the top was a little garret or kind of attic space. And this was the place that Harriet Jacobs stayed in hiding for 7 years while she was trying to gain her freedom. One of the reasons why she didn't go north is because she did not want to leave her children while they were still enslaved. And she wanted to secure their futures before she left. So I'll read from chapter 21. She says, a small shed had been added to my grandmother's house years ago. Some boards were laid across the joists at the top, and between these boards and the roof was a very small garret, never occupied by anything but rats and mice. It was a pent roof covered with nothing but shingles, according to the Southern custom for such buildings. The garret was only 9 feet long and 7 feet wide. The highest part was 3 feet high and sloped down abruptly to the loose board floor. There was no admission for either light or air. My Uncle Philip, who was a carpenter, had very skillfully made a concealed trap door, which communicated with the storeroom. He had been doing this while I was waiting in the swamp. The storeroom opened upon a piazza. To this hole I was conveyed as soon as I entered the house. The air was stifling, the darkness total. A bed had been spread on the floor. I could sleep quite comfortably on one side, but the slope was so sudden that I could not turn on the other without hitting the roof. The rats and mice ran over my bed, but I was weary, and I slept such sleep as the wretched may, when a tempest had passed over them. Morning came. I knew it only by the noises I heard, for in my small den, day and night were all the same. I suffered for air even more than for light. But I was not comfortless. I heard the voices of my children. I mentioned in the last lecture a little bit about the town in North Carolina that Harriet Jacobs was from. We know from the work of a historian named Jean Fagan Yellen that the town and all the locations of everything that happened in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And so we know that Harriet Jacobs' grandmother's house was only a block or so away from Dr. Norcom's house where Harriet Jacobs was enslaved. And so she was in very close proximity to where Norcom himself was. So when we say the last place they ever thought of, we really mean it, right? Her grandmother's house was not far away. It was really in the same space where she went to find freedom. And as difficult and as oppressive as this space was, her comfort was there, which was her children. So as she starts to define what is the loophole of retreat, she talks about what her loophole was. And she basically uses a little tool that she found that was her uncle's that he used to make the trap door to make a little hole that she says was about 1 inch by 1 inch. This is just a random picture that I found online of like a hole in an attic. But I think her hole was a little bigger than that one, but just barely, right? And she made this hole in order so that she would get a little light that she would be able to see. And she started in the text, she calls it her loophole. So she says, I sat at my loophole. The first person, and this is like the first thing she sees after she makes this little loophole. The first person I saw on the street was Dr. Flint. That's again, Dr. Norcom. I had a shuddering, superstitious feeling that it was a bad omen. Several familiar faces passed by. At last I heard the merry laughing of children, and presently 2 sweet little faces were looking up at me, as though they knew I was there and were conscious of the joy that they imparted. How I longed to tell them I was there. My condition was now a little improved, but for weeks I was tormented by hundreds of little red insects, fine as a needle's point, that pierced through my skin. The heat of my den was intense, but I had my consolations. Through my peeping hole, I could watch the children, and when they were near enough, I could hear their talk. And she also says later, my eyes had become accustomed to the dim light, and by holding my book or her sewing work in a certain position near the aperture, I contrived to read and sew. That was a great relief to the tedious monotony of my life. I think about 7 years is very tedious being inside of there. But she spends a lot of time talking about what it meant to look outside of this loophole onto the faces of her children. And sometimes she even imagined they were looking straight up at her. Her family could not tell the children that she was there because they might accidentally expose her. And so that's the reason why she never talked to them and she didn't interact with them at all. But she watched them every single day playing outside right in front of where she was. And she would listen to them. She would talk about hearing them laugh, and that being a mother for her was so important, and being able to watch over her children. And so you have a lot of historians of Black women's history and scholars in Black studies who talk about this loophole of retreat as being so key in this narrative. It's the ways in which she was able to take this small confining space and gain power, have a connection to her children, to even look out into the scene of this town, to look down on her enslaver and have power over him, knowing he was doing things like looking for her. She played a lot of tricks, I guess you could call them, on him, in the sense that she gave him a lot of false starts. So she had people post her letters so that it made it look like she was in the north, and she would watch him like go walk so that he could go north and go looking for her. And in fact, Yellen, the historian who I said has found all the primary sources to confirm this story, has found stuff from his own archive that, like, when he thought he had found her up north and got one of those letters and like went away. So that's like, it's actually a true story. I just have to highlight that because I know it sounds like it's not true. And so when we return to that question, how did enslaved people use spaces of oppression to create their own notions of freedom, family, self, and power? We can think about the loophole of retreat as one of those spaces, right? A physical space that is both oppressive, but also becomes this loophole of retreat into a kind of freedom. And I think here, thinking about space, physical space is really useful in teaching that lesson because it allows us to see that in a really tangible way. And this is just a photograph from one of my classes. It has some students who worked on a exhibit. This was back when I lived in Buffalo, that they put up in a middle school for students to interact with. And one of my students actually made a replica of the garret. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this, and you can find the exact dimensions online, is that it allows students to feel that space of oppression and then imagine what a loophole of retreat might be like. right? It's one thing to say that this was a very small space that she lived in for 7 years. She talks about the way it disabled her body. When she got out, she could hardly walk, as you could imagine. She did try to do exercises when she could and come down at night if it was safe, but it wasn't always safe to do so. And so that confining space, like understanding how oppressive the space is, you're able to do in these really tangible ways. So I'll just say, like, I don't mean to think about this as a project that students would do, like reenacting or plays, but really to think about what is the space, the physical geography of slavery and freedom, and thinking about how you can teach in a tangible way what that geography looks like. And it's a cool project. People like building things, I think. I just want to point out one other story. I mean, a lot of these stories of fugitivity sound really unbelievable, but it's not, she's not the only one. So the other kind of example of the last place they thought of I want to give is just a real quick mention of Ellen and William Craft, which some of you may know about. They have a slave narrative that they wrote, which is called Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, or The Escape, or of or the escape of William and Ellen Craft from slavery. And William and Ellen Craft were a married couple, or a couple, since you couldn't legally marry during slavery, who wanted to escape enslavement. And the ways in which they did it was Ellen Craft was an extremely light-skinned enslaved person. And so she cross-dressed as a white man, and William Craft pretended to be her slave. And they escaped by taking the train in first class in grand style, by trying to inhabit the body of enslaver. And so here you can see a picture from their narrative of Ellen Craft dressed as a man. And scholars have also written about part of this disguise was to just dress as a disabled man so that it would seem like he needed intensive care from his valet enslaved person, but also to kind of, so people wouldn't look too closely and notice, like, this is a woman. So the last place they thought of, I think, is this space of Black creativity, of Black resistance, of that kind of internal world that African Americans were able to build despite a system of slavery, right? The ways in which we think about these things as being unbelievable is partially because it's hard to imagine how enslaved people could be so genius and work so hard against the system in ways that other people just couldn't see, right? It was totally invisible to the white world of the South at that time. And so part of what Harriet Jacobs means when she says the last place they thought of is like that kind of genius of hiding in plain sight. I want to just read from the end of Harriet Jacobs' time in the garret. Eventually, she's finally able to get her Samuel Sawyer to buy her children. It was very complicated. He had to pretend like he wasn't the one buying them, but he was able to buy them from Dr. Norcom. And he never emancipated them, by the way, so their father owned them, but he allowed them to live with her grandmother. And eventually Harriet Jacobs felt like it was time for her to go north. So she says, there's this last time that she went up into her little nook. Its desolate appearance no longer chilled me, for the light of hope had risen in my soul. Yet even with the blessed prospect of freedom before me, I felt very sad at leaving forever that old homestead where I had been sheltered so long by the dear old grandmother. where I had dreamed my first young dream of love, and where after that had faded away, my children came to twine themselves so closely round my desolate heart. As the hour approached for me to leave, I again descended to the storeroom. My grandmother and Benny were there. She took me by the hand and said, Linda, remember that's her pseudonym in the book. Linda, let us pray. We knelt down together with my child pressed to my heart and my other arm around the faithful, loving old friend I was about to leave forever. Okay, that is all I have for the presentation. We might have, well, I guess I'm right on time. So I think I'll end it there.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons. This was fantastic. Your timing's perfect, so well done, and have a great rest of your day.